Okay, I'm opening the meeting now.
Hi everyone, we still have participants joining the room, so we'll just give it a minute or so while we let everyone in. Thank you. All right, thank you everyone. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening. Welcome to today's Global Hack webinar on the topic of eliminate and restrict problematic single-use plastic products and packaging. On behalf of the co-chairs of the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution, Norway and Rwanda, I thank you for joining us today. My name is Cameron Colbatch from the Australian Government, and I'm delighted to be your webinar moderator today. Here in Australia, it's customary to begin formal meetings with what we call an acknowledgement of country, where we recognise the traditional, and that is the Indigenous owners of the land on which we meet. To this end, I'd like to first acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional owners of the land here in the city of Canberra, and I acknowledge their continuing connection to the land and pay respects to their elders past and present. The purpose of today's webinar is to discuss the issue of problematic single-use plastics. And we'll be discussing the disproportionate contribution they make to plastic pollution, and importantly, the specific treaty provisions needed to eliminate and restrict their production and use. To guide our deliberations, we are joined by an expert panel of speakers with diverse expertise in research, advocacy, and government policy implementation. Following the speaker presentations, we will use the remainder of the time for questions to the panel. So please keep your questions ready and send them through in the chat. But first, let us begin with a short video prepared by the High Ambition Coalition. Thank you.
Plastic pollution constitutes a planetary crisis with impacts on our ecosystems, biodiversity, climate, and health. There are more than 10,000 unique chemicals used in plastics. Around a quarter of these are potentially dangerous, and human exposure to these chemicals is linked to illnesses such as cancer, diabetes, and reproductive disorders. Plastic is made up of a mixture of different polymers and chemicals, which makes it very hard to recycle plastic waste to be used again for new products. Certain plastic products are particularly prone to littering, such as loss of fishing gear or disposal of single-use products, causing lethal and sublethal effects on marine life. Some countries have already banned or restricted some plastic products, such as plastic bags and single-use items. But this is not enough. The High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution is committed to developing an ambitious, international, legally binding instrument to eliminate harmful plastics. The Plastics Treaty should require all parties to eliminate and restrict the production and use of polymers, chemicals, and plastic products of concern. Parties must agree on criteria to identify polymers, chemicals, and products that are harmful to the environment and human health, that impede circularity, or are at risk of being released into the environment. All parties should apply import and export requirements on the listed polymers, chemicals, and plastic products, and prohibit the export of these non-conforming items to other countries. Let's end plastic pollution by 2040.
Thank you. So you'll probably be aware that this is one webinar as part of a series that have been run by the High Ambition Coalition. And this one is to specifically target the issue of problematic single-use plastics and packaging. And so I guess it's helpful to provide some background as to why we feel that this webinar is needed. Firstly, we have at the moment an unsustainable relationship with plastics. Too much of it is designed for short-term use only and then sent directly to disposal. And too much of this leaks into the environment. Of all the plastic ever produced, only a fraction has been recycled. And single-use plastics epitomise the linear approach that we currently have for plastic products. If we are to transition to a more circular economy for plastics, we need to firstly eliminate the plastics we don't need and then recycle those that we do need. I'll now move over to the panelist component of the webinar. Firstly, please let me introduce our first panelist, Dr. Denise Hardesty, a Principal Research Scientist at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation in Australia. Dr. Hardesty is an international expert when it comes to plastic pollution monitoring, and she has applied her expertise in over 20 countries, with a recent focus in Southeast Asia. She joins us now from Thailand to brief us on what the research says about the contribution that problematic single-use plastics make to plastic pollution. Thanks, Denise.
Thank you so much, and a pleasure to be here. Appreciate everyone joining online from wherever you are in the world. To give a little bit of information about single-use plastics, no matter what survey method you use, whether it's a cleanup activity, if it's a designed survey, and no matter where you are in the world, the majority of what we find littered in the environment comes from single-use plastics. And that means everything from plastic bags and bottles, containers, plastic cutlery, to cigarette butts and things like that. And so if we think about what are the single-use plastics that are problematic, they tend to be the things that we find in our bin every day that go out to be collected as rubbish, depending upon where you are in the world. And the research has shown that the most problematic items to marine wildlife, including seabirds, marine mammals, turtles, and other organisms, tend to be associated with single-use plastics, in particular soft plastic bags. As you see in one of the images here, there are everything from balloon pieces and fragments to bottle caps, lids, and components like that. And those are the items that we know are most frequently lost into the environment and that tend to cause the most harm to our wildlife. And that also includes then to our people, our communities, and to tourism. We also find much more of these types of items lost into the environment near our urban or city centers, on beaches in the surrounding areas. We also know that much or most of what we find becomes broken down in the environment, and we still find much more of this in closer proximity to our city centers. This is comprised of everything from polystyrene or expanded polystyrene to high density polyethylene, or PET, which comprises the plastic bottles that you see with the person lying there in a pile of bottles. I know I don't have much time here, so I'm going to turn over to the next speaker, but the research has consistently and ubiquitously shown that the frequency of single-use items, whether it's on the coastline, on the bottom of the seabed floor, or anywhere in between, tends to be associated with single-use plastics. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions at the end for you as well. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to our second speaker, Lizzie Fuller, who joins us from a very early morning in Amsterdam. Lizzie represents the Minderoo Foundation, and you may be familiar with the Minderoo Foundation's recent work to address the information gaps regarding human health impacts associated with plastic pollution. Today, Lizzie will talk us through the projected increase of problematic single-use plastics under a business as usual scenario. Thank you, Lizzie.
Thanks very much, Cameron. Thank you for having me. So as Cameron mentioned, I'm going to paint the picture of business as usual scenario for single-use plastics production and waste, really to frame our conversation of the ways that the treaty can respond. Many of you will be well aware of the contours of this picture, and particularly this first graph that's on screen at the moment. Unfortunately, on our current global trajectory, both plastic consumption and plastic waste are set to almost triple by 2060. To begin with plastic use, packaging will account for a large proportion of the projected increase, and at more than a 2.5 times growth factor from 2019 to 2060. There's also projected to be a substantial increase in the polymers that are used for packaging. So for example, low density polyethylene triples compared to 2019, and polypropylene, high density polyethylene and PET, all used in packaging, are projected to more than double. And then to plastic waste, under a BAU scenario, projected increase in plastic waste are mostly driven by products with short lifespans. And as you can see here, the plastic waste from packaging will increase substantially under BAU. Not quite at the rate of some other segments, but still significant and making up the largest category shown here. And in 2060, half of all of this plastic waste will still be landfilled and less than a fifth recycled on the OECD analysis. Next slide, please. Now I'll hone in on some analysis from Minderoo Foundation's most recent Plastic Waste Makers Index, which we released in February this year. And we call it the Waste Makers Index because we look upstream to the sources of the single-use plastic that ultimately ends up in municipal solid waste. And to do this analysis, we look at the 6 main polymers that account for more than 90% of single-use plastics. And the headline finding from this year's report is unfortunately no surprise, but should concern us deeply. An additional 6 million metric tonnes was generated in 2021 compared to 2019, and this was still almost entirely made from virgin fossil fuel feedstocks. And this increase equates to roughly an additional kilogram more plastic packaging waste per person on the planet just across these 2 years. And then digging a bit deeper into this, as you can see from the slide here, the growth in single-use plastics made from virgin polymers was 15 times that from recycled feedstocks. So this really brings home that recycling is failing to scale fast enough. And what we also saw in this round was that growth was driven by demand for flexible packaging, like films and sachets. And this in itself is concerning as a trend because flexible plastics have lower collection rates, are more difficult to sort and recycle, and have higher rates of leakage into the environment. And next slide, please. So in this year's index, as well as looking at end-of-life plastic waste, we also looked at the greenhouse gas emissions associated with single-use plastic production. And we estimated that the global cradle-to-grave emissions from single-use plastics alone were roughly equivalent to those of the UK. And emissions intensity kind of varies based on what polymers are produced and how they are produced. But what we can see here in general terms is that the upstream segment is responsible for most emissions. Producing monomers is the most emissions intensive at a third, and conversion of polymers into plastic products is then the second and accounts for 22% of emissions across the life cycle. So just reinforcing that the creation of new plastic for single-use or short-life products just doesn't stack up from a climate perspective as well as a waste perspective, and that reducing demand for plastics does remain a critical lever for also impacting emissions. Beyond that, there's also health considerations, which were touched on in the last HAC webinar co-hosted by Ecuador and Panama, so I won't go into those today, but please check that out. So I hope this quick tour has highlighted something of the range and scale of the issues we're looking at just with the single-use plastic sector. And to close with a few comments that we might pick up later in the discussion, if we want to make a dent on the scale and range of the issues here, it's clear that it won't be enough to ban particular products alone. Significantly, we also need to address the market failures that are seeing this overall increase in single-use plastic production and consumption. And then we can talk later about some of the various control measures that could assist. Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. I now welcome to the floor Alfred Relifo, who's the WWF's lead in the Pacific. And Alfred will share some very useful analysis that the WWF has done recently on the global landscape of those countries already taking action on problematic single-use products. It's important to note in the treaty context that this is not new ground. Many countries have taken action already, and Alfred will share more details on that just to show us the extent of action to date. Thanks, Alfred.
Thank you, and Bula Vinaka, pleasure to be here. Next slide, please. So these maps are based on UNEP's 2018 review of legal limits on single-use plastics and microplastics, which has been updated with additional measures that have come into effect since the report was first published. The first slide shows widespread existing of regulations of thin plastic shopping bags. It's worth noting that the increasing number of laws and regulations also restricting thicker bags and bags used for other purposes, for example, fish, fruits, and vegetables. So the orange colored areas shows national measures as well, and the regional measures are shown in blue. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the spread of existing laws and regulations aiming to reduce single-use plastics for a range of applications. Countries that restrict the availability of 3 products or polymers or more through either bans or fees have been colored. There are a few points worth making about these slides. Around 80 countries already regulate certain products, polymers, or additives. And products that are commonly targeted include plastic bags, bowls, cotton buds, straws, packaging, footwear, and others. Polymers and additives that are commonly targeted are expanded polystyrene, microbeads, and oxydegradables. And generally, the purpose of these instruments is to reduce plastic consumption, waste generation, and pollution. It's importantly, some measures are combined and measures specifically aimed at increasing reuse, repair, and circularity, not just at reducing use of certain categories of plastics. From these maps, we can see that regulations of single-use plastics is very widespread already, though there are clear gaps that still exist. Particularly, the evidence base already shows us that while these measures can be effective within national borders, effectively address the transboundary problem of growing levels of plastic waste pollution. Next slide, please. The final slide shows which member states express support for bans or phase out of single-use plastic categories in the submissions to the INC Secretariat on core obligations and control measures. The Secretariat's option papers provides a number of options for control measures and voluntary approaches to banning, phasing out, or reducing the use of problematic and avoidable plastic products and chemicals and polymers of concern. As the Secretariat's option paper states, research has shown that it will be possible and economically feasible to reduce the consumption of short-lived plastic products by 30% by 2040, while respecting the needs of a growing population and economy. And many countries are already responding to this challenge through a range of measures. While the Secretariat's paper provides options for control measures and voluntary approaches, we can see from these maps that there is already very strong support for control measures to address this challenge rather than voluntary approaches. WWF's analysis of submissions found that 132 states have expressed support for global bans and phase-out requirements to eliminate one or more plastic categories of concern. In conclusion, some final points are worth making on core obligations and control measures relating to single-use plastic products and other categories of plastics. Number one, global rules are more effective against transboundary and movement of waste and pollution, especially in the marine environment where regulations by individual countries cannot. Global rules would actually reduce complexity for governments and a level playing field for businesses. WWF will soon be publishing a comprehensive analysis of this issue, including a risk-based approach to categories and access single-use plastic products that could be banned immediately and in the long term. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alfred. Our next speaker is also joining us from the Pacific, and you may have noticed we have a bit of a Pacific theme for this webinar. And I'd also like to say hello and a shout out to our Pacific colleagues who are joining us from the Cook Islands at a preparatory meeting ahead of the next round of negotiations. Our next speaker is Andrea Valentras, and Andrea is the project manager of the Pacific Ocean Litter Project within the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program. In his role, Andrea provides assistance to Pacific Island countries as they take steps to phase out problematic single-use plastics. And Andrea is usually based in Samoa, but joins us now from the Cook Islands to tell us about progress being made by Pacific Island countries. Thanks, Andrea.
Thanks very much, Cameron. And I'm sorry I can't come on screen, show you my handsome face because we're having internet connections. So I'll speak to the table that's on the screen right now. And in my 5 minutes, and well, before I start, I'd like to say we're very honored to have the Ambassador for Palau, and also the Chair of Pacific SIDS with us today, and also the Director General of the Secretariat of Pacific Regional Environment Program, and distinguished representatives from around the Pacific. So on to the presentation. If you look at that screen, we've seen the big picture, what's happening globally. But on this screen, on this picture, you can see that the Pacific Island countries have been doing their very best to address the issue of single-use plastics, or core obligation 2 of the options paper, unnecessary avoidable plastics. So if you look at the table there, you see there's been a mixture of countries that have got policies to address single-use plastics. Tonga, I think, is the latest one. That's why it's in light blue. It's trying to get that completed. And then we have countries that have regulated against single-use plastics by bans, phase-outs, restrictions. And you can see that applies to plastic bags, polystyrene plates, straws, styrofoam, cups, crockery, cutlery, PET bottles, plastic ice block pouches, nappies. So that whole range. And then there's economic instruments like container deposit schemes, levies, and then there's a couple engaged in recycling of plastics for overseas markets. So that's all very good. And I think this all started around 2010, and nearly every single country there has done something, either a policy or a regulation or economic instrument to address single-use plastics. Solomons is the latest country that's going to sort of get a regulation done this year before the Pacific Games. So it's looking good. We're on a roll. But having said that, you know, there's a lot of issues. There's issues with institutional capacity. You have limited staff trying to handle waste management generally, not just plastics, and a whole range of other issues, jobs that they have, collecting the garbage around the country. You've got leakage at the border. A lot of plastic might be banned, but you go to the supermarket, there it is, it's on the shelves. Might not be a single plastic bag, but you know, it's the whole roll of them. And then all other issues associated with being a small island state and capacities and yeah, okay, so then we get cleanups in Palau. There's been many, but the problem is, like, then a few months later, the rubbish comes back. So it is a problem. Anyway, the point of me trying to present this is to say, yes, we're doing what we can in the Pacific, and we're very serious about it, but we need a global instrument to reinforce the local effort. There was a study put out by Dr. Tricia Farrelly and colleagues called Plastic Pollution Prevention in Pacific Island Countries, Gap Analysis of Current Legislation, Policies, Plans. So they basically identified the gaps, which are in the white there, but also the thesis of their report was, in order to address these issues and prevent growing volumes of increasingly problematic types of plastics, we need a global agreement, because for the 1.3% that we are responsible for a plastic pollution globally, we need to fix the 8.7% that's coming into our EEZs and our coastlines. And that's why a global treaty is needed. because we can't do this by ourselves. We really need the producers and the people that are causing this pollution from the estuaries and the rivers that rim our Pacific Islands to take serious action. With that said, I just want to conclude by saying, therefore, even if that whole table was in green and we achieved what we could do there domestically, it still would be a problem because of the external inflows of plastic pollution. With that, I'd like to pass on to my tag team partner, Director of Environment, Hala Tuofu.
Good on Cameron, and thank you for the opportunity to talk today. Similar to Andre, we're unable to come on screen, but we'll be discussing from behind the scenes. So I don't have a presentation today, but my job was to discuss the experiences as the Cook Islands in phasing out single-use plastics and what is our need for global measures to complement our national actions. So from a Cook Islands context, and similar to our Pacific neighbors, we are overwhelmed with waste management systems, especially with single-use plastics, which has filled our landfill. There's also a significant leakage of plastic pollution to the environment and human health. And this is quite prominent all across the islands. We're also experiencing waste colonialism. A lot of washed up plastic waste is on our shores, and we're unable to track and trace where did this plastic originate from. We're not producers of plastics, and we're fully aware of that, but we're also consumers, and therefore the discussions on trade needs to be elevated to the global stage. In the Cook Islands, we have introduced a single-use plastics regulation in 2012. There has been some promotions of the recycling, or the 3 Rs, as a primary commitment to our fight against plastic pollution. What we also have done is for our Infrastructure Cook Islands Department, they are introducing a new bill on solid and hazardous waste, which we will have a new schedule by mid-year on a new list of plastic items that will add to the ban list. And this is a combination of plastic straws, cutleries, plastic containers with no PET numbers, and a range of different types of plastics, all the way down to single-serve butter and spreads. So this is also going to be accompanied by enforcing an advanced disposable recovery fee as we start tagging items that we need to start collecting for the cost of disposal. Also in the Cook Islands, we have secured funding under JEF 8 under a STAR allocation for the Circular Solutions Plastic Pollution Integrated Program. So this is a $3 million funding that's available to the Cook Islands that will help us with our enabling environment. So this includes gap analysis, our plastics policy, and ensuring that our legislation is well versed in all the areas required for plastics. And this is where we'll also look at industry initiatives that involves design and sustainability criteria. The need for the Cook Islands to be a part of have global measures to complement our national actions is simply to reduce the level of plastics that are being produced and also consumed. There's a need for us to start looking at reduction in the amount of problematic and unnecessary plastic used, and a shift to reuse and reduction of very short-lived items. There's a need for us to look at the global stage the design for circularity, ensure that there's increasing plastic items that are designed specifically to circulate, and there is elements of recyclability, elimination of problematic design elements, and a shift to alternatives, which also includes traditional methods that we are quite well versed here in the Pacific. We also need to look at circulating practice, so implementing of policies and innovative business models which ensure material circulating practice, including reusable systems and incentives, penalties, or recycling. The global treaty will also help us identify a means of implementation. So in the Cook Islands, there's a need for us to look at financial and technology transfer, especially around technical cooperation, and looking at multilateral fund that would be able to provide assistance in the fight against plastic pollution. So there's certainly a need for us to look at this global treaty from the context of complementing our national efforts to ensure that we're able to curb and looking at a significant reduction in plastic pollution by 2040. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Halatoa. It was really useful, and Andre as well. And I'd also like to welcome our dignitaries who are joining us in Cook Islands as well. Thank you. So that concludes our speakers session, and I might just summarise some of the key points that I picked up. From Denise, we heard that problematic single-use plastics are the key litter problem that we need to take action on. And from Lizzie from Minderoo, we heard that left unchecked, the PSAP problem and associated consequences will get much worse, and particularly alarming to hear that the greenhouse gas contribution of single-use plastics is comparable to total emissions from the UK. From Alfred, we heard about the many countries that are already taking action, but the next step is a global response. And from Andrea, we heard about the many Pacific Island countries who are already taking great action, but even if all of those countries had phased out all problematic single-use plastics, they would still have the issue of plastic washing up in their shores from abroad. And also thank you to Halatoa for his sharing his local implementation experiences in the Cook Islands and highlighting the need for us to reduce single-use plastics. He talked about potential for sustainable design criteria and the treaty assisting with implementation as well. We will now move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Please feel free to submit your questions via the chat. And in the meantime, I have a few questions to put to the panel to get the ball rolling. Maybe my first question is to Denise, who spoke about what the research says on problematic single-use plastics. I'm keen to know, Denise, what does the evidence say in terms of do bans work? Where a country implements a ban, what do you see before and after?
So that's a really great question, and I think it's a really relevant one for this audience to be considering. We know that bans work and that incentives in particular work. So if we have a ban without enforcement, it doesn't tend to be as effective. But what we are seeing is that people, community members, et cetera, they really do want to do the right thing. The data is showing that when we have the infrastructure, when we have the alternative products, et cetera, people really do want to abide by that. So we do see a very high level of effectiveness with incentives and with bans. So even if it is a small incentive, people return their bottles, they stop using plastic bags. So both bans and incentives tend to be highly effective, and that's been evaluated across a range of countries. And we see the associated change from those actions, from those bans, from those incentives very, very quickly. There are terrific examples from countries around the world, from Seychelles and Kenya to Galapagos and Australia and beyond. So we know that those can be incredibly effective. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Denise. And maybe just following on from that, I have a question for you, Alfred. Your slides showed that many countries are already taking action, and we presume more countries will in the future. So given that, why is there a need for the treaty to have specific provisions on eliminating problematic single-use plastics if countries are already acting?
Thank you, Cameron. I think the country level actions that I had shown on the maps represents the current status quo. And it's what we've been doing for a long time, and yet we still have not been able to address the transboundary problem of plastic pollution. So it can be effective in some respects, but it cannot effectively address this transboundary problem. So the submission from the University of Portsmouth Global Plastic Policy Center drew recommendations from a comprehensive review of evidence, finding that whilst existing legislation is successful working towards the goal of eliminating unnecessary or problematic plastics, a harmonized global rule is still essential. Global rules would actually provide, will actually help to reduce the complexity for governments and provide a level playing field for businesses. And the status quo of patchwork of varying rules based on different definitions is challenging for governments to manage and enforce, particularly for small island developing states. So that is why we definitely need global rules and processes and guidelines to help address transboundary plastic problems, would then help us small island states to be able to effectively address the current plastic pollution that is impacting our countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Alfred. I'll now take a question from the floor. Thomas Novotny, if you can turn your camera on and take yourself off mute and introduce where you're from. Thank you.
Yes, this is Thomas Novotny. I am a public health physician based in San Diego, California. And I'm looking to see if I can turn on my camera, but if I can't, I'm on my cell phone. But let me just say my main concern, and that is I'm glad that Denise had mentioned the issue of cigarette butts, because they are, in fact, the single most picked up item of trash around the world, as many people, I think, can recognize. They're a cellulose acetate filter is the plastic product. And this is found on almost all of the 6 trillion cigarettes that are sold commercially, globally. We don't know how many for sure end up as trash on beaches or in urban areas, but we do know that from 25 to 60% of people admit to dumping their butts somewhere. Now, there's not been an effort to ban the sale of filtered cigarettes, partly because the concept of filter is still sort of calling up that this is a safety item, and it isn't. And the point that I would like to make is that cellulose acetate filters are in no way a health item, a health protective item. They are, in fact, a single-use plastic, and they could, in fact, be banned. There's been some attempts at this, but so far there hasn't been yet either local or state or national jurisdiction that have taken it on. And I'd like to bring that up as an idea for people to consider. Thank you very much.
Cameron, could I add to that? Just
Please.
Briefly. Thank you so much, Thomas, for your comment. I'm not sure you are aware of the organization No More Butts, but there is an organization that is specifically addressing and tackling that and aiming to put forth legislation for the ban of cigarette filters. So I'm happy to put you in contact with the lead person there, but there is at least an increased focus and growth on tackling that specific issue. And you are correct, from global cleanup data still around the world, cigarette butts remain the #1 most frequently littered item that is found in the environment. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. We also have a question from the floor from Dr. Anya Brandon. I've just been told you won't be able to turn on your camera, but if you can take yourself off mute, and we'd love to hear from you, Anya. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Anya Brandon from Ocean Conservancy, and I'm calling in today from Portland, Oregon in the United States. I wanted to take a moment just to elevate the need for a source reduction mandate with a particular focus on these single-use plastics that we've been talking about to be considered by negotiators during the INC2 discussions, really to make this international agreement effective in carrying out the needed system change to meet the urgency of this moment. Study after study have shown that to keep plastics out of our ocean, we need to reduce plastic production and increase our recycling rates. You know, half of all plastics ever made have been made in the last 20 years, which means what we do in the next 20 years is going to matter a lot. And fortunately, we have the tools and the knowledge to tackle this crisis. Scientists have estimated that to reduce ocean plastic pollution from where it's predicted to go back to 2010 levels of 8 million metric tons a year, which is still 8 million metric tons too many, we need to reduce plastic use and consumption by 25 to 40%. Since 40% of plastics produced each year is for packaging, targeting single-use plastic packaging and foodware must be central to any strategy. And fortunately, there is precedent for this type of bold and ambitious source reduction. Last year, California, which represents the 5th largest economy in the world, passed a bill that will require exactly this, a 25% reduction in all single-use plastic packaging and foodware over the next 10 years. This policy is expected to prevent about 23 million tons of single-use plastics, or equivalent to the weight of 26 Golden Gate bridges. Ocean Conservancy data from the last 35 years shows that focusing on the most common plastic pollution items on our beaches are not recyclable, meaning that they had no pathway to enter the circular economy in the first place, which is why we are calling on negotiators to include source reduction requirements and mandates targeting these single-use plastics as part of the agreement. Thank you for this wonderful panel and for the opportunity to speak to this issue. And thank you, Australia, for convening us here today, and as well as Norway and Rwanda, and the co-chairs for the High Ambitious Coalition for their vision and ambition for this process.
Thank you, Anya. I've got another question for potentially Lizzie or Halatoa, and that is, what implementation challenges do you think the treaty could assist with? So to help countries to implement bans. I might throw to you, Lizzie, first.
Sure, thanks, Cameron. Yeah, and I'd like to pick up on some of the points that have already been raised, actually, about the need for harmonisation and the support that that can provide in and of itself in terms of implementation. And we could also then see international coordination on trade-related restrictions on bans and imports and exports. But yeah, I would really stress the importance of the harmonisation and also the transparency that can come from harmonised international measures and additional data that can help us manage the problem.
Great, thanks, Lizzie. Halatoa, is there anything you'd like to add from a country perspective in terms of what, how treaty provisions would help you as the head of an agency responsible for phasing out these products? How would a treaty assist you? Well, it sounds like we might have a connection issue there. I'll move on to the next question. And that is, this may be back to you, Lizzie. What specific provisions do you think are needed in the treaty? We've been talking about this issue, and I think there's general agreement that the treaty does need to consider the issue of problematic single-use plastics, but what specifically do you think success looks like in terms of what does the treaty look like on this issue?
Thanks, and I'd also like to pick up on some of Anya's points here in this regard. But maybe firstly, I think since we're talking about sort of specific elimination and restrict measures in this webinar, just to touch on, you know, a general obligation that the treaty will need to have for each party to eliminate or restrict specific problematic plastics that are identified. And there's been various criteria that have been put forward for what those categories could look like, things like plastics that are not essential, that are avoidable or replaceable, and are not recyclable or that hinder recyclability, that have toxic or hazardous components or high likelihood of becoming litter. So there's some of the sort of common factors that are put forward. And certainly that's not a list of ands, it's a list of ors. And then on top of the specific elimination measures, we clearly need to see sort of overall reduction targets to make a dent on the problem. And they could be global targets across all plastics or targets for certain specified categories, for example, packaging. Given we saw in some of the slides I showed earlier, the huge contribution that packaging has to overall plastic waste. And then coupled with measures that can help drive a shift towards circularity and that can address some of the market failures that we see currently hampering efforts to tackle the problem. So here, things like levies and incentives can be helpful to both drive production down as well as accelerate the shift to circularity, with the additional benefit of contributing to implementation funding. And I just want to sort of finally mention the need to avoid regrettable substitution when we're looking at single-use plastic measures. And I think others might want to talk more about that. So I'll sort of potentially hand back to you, Cameron, for
Thank you. That does cover off on a few questions that we're seeing in the chat. There's a question from Priti Mahesh. Is there a list of single-use plastic products? I see confusion in definition. It would be good if the treaty lists this out. And similarly, we had an earlier question from Christine. Please respond to the claim that single-use beverage containers are not single-use, even if they are recycled. I'm not sure if any of our panelists would like to talk to that issue on how do we define problematic single-use plastics. And I do suspect this is something that the treaty will need to consider. Are there any panelists would like to talk to that?
I can talk to it briefly if you like, and we can certainly throw back to others on the line here. So the the comment or question is correct that there are some conflicting definitions, and there are a number of different cases that are being brought before legislative processes around the definitions of single-use plastics and what's considered in and what is out. And I think there are a number of different approaches that are being used for the definition. So I guess in short, I agree with you that it will be very important for the treaty for the member states to come to an agreement regarding the definition in terms of what is in and out of scope for what is included in single-use plastics. I think that also comes to one of the first questions or comments from Christine Kubat, who asked for there to be a response to the claim that single-use beverage containers are not single-use if they're recycled. The current standing definition is that items that are made to be used once in their current form and for a short period of time, as mentioned. So it would include anything from a plastic bread bag for the what you purchase your bread in, to a beverage container because you typically would purchase that. And yes, people may reuse those plastic water bottles or reuse those beverage containers, but they do typically fall under the definition of what is considered or construed of as a single-use plastic item. Same as takeaway food containers and takeaway cutlery items and plastic straws and cigarettes, as was mentioned earlier, and a whole laundry list of other items. But there is legislation under consideration in a number of jurisdictions to address that. So it is a contentious or an area of concern with definitions that are bandied about in different jurisdictions. Does anybody else want to pick up and add to that? Thank you.
Okay, I might follow on a related topic though. We have a few questions about regrettable substitutes. So I might put this question to you, Alfred. How do we avoid regrettable substitutes for problematic single-use plastics and incentivize desirable alternatives? And regrettable substitutes in this context might be phasing out one particular single-use plastic product and replacing it with another fibre-based product that may have the unintended consequences of having a high carbon footprint or including chemicals of concern in its composition. So I'll hand over to you, Alfred, if you're okay to talk to this one.
Sure, thank you, Cameron. I think you've clearly mentioned that we don't want a plastic alternative that will be very, very harmful to nature and also to humans as well. But I think that as part of this treaty, I think the most important component of the core obligations is the measures that will help drive reuse and repair at scale, and at the same time avoidance of these regrettable substitutes. And this would then needs to be supported by alternative measures more suited to national context. We also have to consider, the important role of traditional knowledge in this situation over here. So for Pacific Island countries, traditional baskets and materials woven from nature could be very helpful. It could also help to drive local economy of grassroots communities, but at the same time help to replace harmful and regrettable alternatives. And I think what we also need to do, and a responsibility of all governments and also all stakeholders, is that we need to reduce material consumptions overall. Reduce rather than replace as a part of our first options. And that is a clear responsibility of all stakeholders and governments as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alfred. And I understand we do have our Cook Island participants with us. So maybe if I could ask you to get yourselves ready to go off mute, but I'll just return to that question that I put to Halatoa earlier, and that is what specific treaty provisions would be useful for you as a policy implementer to implement phase outs of problematic single-use plastics, whether that be from the definitional issue right through to implementation. And what challenges do you have at the moment in implementing your work in the absence of global provisions? Hopefully you can jump on, Halatoa.
Thank you, Cam, and apologies for that earlier. I think one of the main areas for us is looking at the the criteria itself, ensuring that there's a development of criteria where the materials, polymers, and products that are problematic are being covered and clearly stipulated in the criteria for this. A registry of product that can be added to this as well. We also look at the criteria definitions that can be adopted at the national level can be stronger than what can be at the global criteria outlined in the annexes. So annexes may include listing of particular chemicals and polymers, products that require elimination. So I think these are areas that we would be looking at to strengthen the definitions on this and having listings that should also include virgin plastic polymers.
Great, thanks, Hawatoa. I've got another general question from the floor from Shane Kukau, and that is this is a bit more of a general question. Of the proposed binding measures under consideration at INC2, which do we consider to be the most impactful? And I might put that to either Lizzie or Denise, or any other speakers as well, if you have any views. So what would be the most impactful measures that the treaty could deliver?
I'm happy to dive in first on that one. So at Minderoo, we really see the need to focus upstream as the area where most impact can be had. So controls on production at the outset are essential. And then coupled with some of the mechanisms that I mentioned earlier that can help with driving a market shift and correcting the market failures that are currently leading to such an unsustainable and increasing level of plastic production. So we would really focus attention at upstream measures, but then complemented by a range of other factors, including addressing chemicals and composition from a health perspective throughout the entire life cycle. Denise.
I might just echo Lizzie's sentiment and add one small thing, and that is the opportunity to actually simplify the polymer pool rather than expand it. And because if we have a simplification or reduction of polymers, we will improve or increase the material recovery opportunity if and as appropriate in a variety of different contexts. So certainly looking at the reduction of production and looking at safe, smart alternatives, of course, but really looking as far up the supply chain as possible. And at the same time, trying to ensure that economic benefits are kept in local communities and that we don't also have a disproportionate or continue with the disproportionate negative impact of the current system that we are operating in the global community. Thanks.
Can I also add that totally agree with the upstream measures. That's very, very important, but also incredibly important as well is the means of implementation, such as technical support and financial support for small island developing states and least developed countries.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions that haven't been addressed in some way. Just want to do a last call for hands up if there are any other questions from the floor.
So Cameron, there is a question regarding disposable nappies or diapers.
Yeah, please.
I may just briefly address that. So there's actually a trial ongoing right now regarding nappy disposal and alternative nappies or diapers. The question regarding is a ban feasible? I think it's important to consider the context and the potential disproportionate impact that may have on people's lives in those communities. I appreciate, particularly in island nations, that we have quite a struggle with waste management, very limited land and very limited opportunities for reducing that with the current systems. I don't know that there are considerations of a ban on nappies or diapers, and I think there are a lot of considerations that would go into that dialogue or discussion, but there are some old school options and opportunities, although people also acknowledge that cloth reusable diapers are more time consuming and that they do require more water usage, for example. So I'll just pause there. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Denise. We might conclude the Q&A session there, just noting the time. Some key takeaways for me are that eliminating and restricting problematic single-use plastics will be critical to achieving our goal of ending plastic pollution. And secondly, though, that we need global approaches to do this, so binding measures in the treaty. And that's in particular to note that it's a transboundary issue, but also to assist in some of the implementation challenges that countries face. Before I conclude today's webinar, I have a few thank yous to make. Firstly, thank you to our panelists for offering their expertise and contributions today. And I would also like to thank the HAC co-chairs, Norway and Rwanda, for making this webinar series possible. And my thanks to Ellen Haugen and Lars Stodel for their work behind the scenes. And finally, I'd like to thank you, the webinar participants. This is a global webinar, and I know some of you have joined us at a very unsociable nighttime hour, so thank you. But also thank you to all of our webinar participants who have joined us. You are all most likely here because you have an interest in or have a role to play in the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee process. Please do not underestimate the importance and responsibility of that role, both for current generations, but also for generations to come. Plastic pollution is a global problem that requires global solutions. And I trust this webinar has provided you with information about the treaty provisions needed so that we can achieve the collective goal of ending plastic pollution. Thank you again for your time and participation, and farewell. Thank you.